simply to restructure how we approach that opportunity, because it is value added.
Yeah, and please submit. Please submit. There are a number of diasporic studies and what have you. Please submit. And I'm going to really try so that there is the interchange that we've been trying to. If everyone comes up here to do a dissertation or to promote their organization, and so all of which is valid, we're going to be here all afternoon. We need to facilitate the dialogue as much as possible. Recognize the next speaker.
Yeah, in addition to looking for new financing mechanisms...
Mike, could you get the mic, please?
Yeah. In addition to looking for new financing mechanisms, I think it is also possible for us to revisit the way in which we invest currently. If you look at the way in which we invest in children, for example, we need to invest earlier and continuously, 0 to 14. To give a concrete example, adolescent pregnancy cost the Bahamas 0.9% of GDP. This is in 2004. And that's equivalent to 3.9% over the lifetime of the mother. For Belize, the country's growth would have been 10% higher, and Suriname 17%, had we done something differently in terms of adolescent pregnancy. The cost of youth unemployment ranged from 0.7% in Suriname in 2004 and to 2.46% in St. Lucia of GDP. At the end of the day, I think that if we can invest differently the resources that we have, just looking at children alone, we will have resources, we will look at prevention, we will have resources available for the things that we need to do. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dorini from Suriname. Governor Rambaran, I think that your presentation and proposal is the most disruptive for this afternoon. In the case of Suriname, the issue of diaspora bond has been put in practice by the state oil company of Suriname. For instance, in 2010, the state oil company wanted to raise $15 million for investment. But instead of that, they raised $55 million. Recently, they issued bonds again to raise $55 million. And last week, they raised $95 million. And part of that money was from Holland. Governor, but this issue is about trust. And people don't trust government. How will you, please provide us with some guidance how to build trust within your proposal. Thank you.
The governor of the central bank of Barbados, recently partnered with the Alzheimer's Association to raise, they wanted to raise, I don't remember the exact numbers, but they got double. And it had to do with Barbados was retiring its cents, and so the lowest denomination is now 5 cents. And they invited the Barbadian public to bring their cents in, get them changed for whatever, and the central bank will pay some part of that to the Alzheimer's Association. They also asked people to donate cents, and people were donating cents in every workplace that you could possibly think of in Barbados. So they raised twice the amount of money they started out. So it's just one modality that I want. As much as we don't trust our governments, we also trust ourselves. And the other thing, last thing I wanted to say, has to do with the notion of human capital. A critique that I have of this conference is the continued extraction and hiding of the humanities as a discipline. And it is that extraction of the humanities from the discussion of economics, that is economics and politics and governance and all of that, that is creating a lot of the difficulties that we have. We could raise a lot more money if we saw ourselves as more than human capital. Thank you.
I have one more for you for a question, moderator, Mr. Prado, and that has to do with something that was mentioned by Professor Bourne, who was actually a former governor of the Caribbean Development Bank, while not the sitting governor. and that has to do with the downgradings of various financial institutions in the region, and whether it's not part of the problem or the contradiction in the region where we're so constricted with multilateral conditionalities, and at the same time, and all the external shocks, and at the same time having to, while take note, having to actually have our economies and financial institutions downgraded by some methodology. And the reference here is, where were they in terms of not downgrading Goldman and Sachs and other big financial names and institutions during the 2008-2009 crisis? So it's over to you, Mr. Prado.
Yeah, thank you very much. To end our session, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Smith, and after to Dr.
Thank you.
Bourne.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Mr. Moderator, I think that many of the concerns raised, many of the issues raised from the floor can be assisted in being addressed within the context of the discourse that is taking place now in the global community. The Sustainable Development Goals that are being discussed cover a wide range of issues. They cover gender equality, for example. They cover infrastructure. They cover sustainable energy. They cover poverty. They cover health. They cover education. They cover inequality. They cover climate and environmental vulnerability. And the objective is to set goals and targets with the agreement of member countries, including countries from the Caribbean, to set indicators that will provide a framework of transparency, monitoring, and accountability that the public, all stakeholders can see what was agreed, how it is being achieved, where shortfalls occur as we evolve over the next few years. I think that framework will be very relevant to the Caribbean if we engage in the process, if we ensure that our priorities are included, if we ensure that the targets and indicators are relevant to us, and if we hold our governments accountable for implementing and reaching those targets and indicators in this entire area, in all these areas that are related to social, economic, and environmental development. It is in that context that I would reiterate that the SDGs provide a very useful framework to achieve and address and respond to many of the kinds of concerns that are being raised here. And so I reiterate that and really urge that at the political level, at the level of the stakeholders, at the level of all those who are interested in Caribbean development, that we put pressure on to ensure that the Caribbean's priorities and concerns and needs are reflected in this framework, in the framework that will be addressed, and that governments will be expected, once they agree to it, to implement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Dr. Bourne?
Yeah, I would emphasize what Mr. Smith has said, that the SDGs address the concerns. I will also add to that that financing is essential for the ability of the Caribbean governments to do all of these things, pretty much all of which have a human face in the end. You know, if governments are investing in education and in health and in sea defenses and in drainage, and all these other things, and then all the environmental things, then they are in fact seeking to advance the interests of people. People are the ultimate beneficiaries of those things. So the focus on how you mobilize resources for doing so, I think is not a misplaced focus at all. It's a very important focus, given the enormity of the financing requirements. I would also say, because I didn't say it in the presentation, that we do have a problem of how more effectively we can utilize existing domestic savings. People mention the various informal savings associations, SUSUs, etc., whatever you call them in different places. But most of those funds end up in commercial banks at some point in time. They end up in credit unions at some point in time. And the key question is, how then do you get a better match between the funds that are in our formal financial institutions and the demand for those funds by enterprises that would use them for production and long-term investment, which would transform the productive capacity, diversify the economy, provide jobs. This is a big challenge. In the region at the moment, in every country, there is a problem of excess liquidity in the commercial banks, meaning that they have high levels of funds that they are not deploying because they see the risk configuration as being not one that they want to deal with. I think that means that we must address ways of providing or assisting banks in their risk management techniques, modernizing decision-making on investment projects in the commercial and financial banking area, commercial and financial lending area, and so on. So that I don't want us to feel that it's only a question of foreign finance. It's a question of getting a better match between what we do save in institutions within our region and what those savings are used for. On the credit rating thing, you know, when we get a good credit rating, we boast. When we get a bad one, we cuss them out. We can't have it both ways. The rating agencies, they have faults. I'm not going to defend the rating agencies. They have faults. But they have a system and certain variables that they look at. And some of those variables are generally important to all persons analyzing the performance of an economy. What might differ is how much significance I might put on the fiscal situation of Trinidad and Tobago or Barbados, so on, and how much emphasis or how negative a rating agency might see it. But the fact of the matter is that the agencies, I think, have been fairly consistent in how they treat countries and institutions. A few countries in Europe got downgraded. The US was threatened with a downgrade by the rating agencies and had to do certain things about its debt to avoid being downgraded. The problem with the risk assessment of Caribbean corporate enterprises comes out of the acute financing problems of Caribbean governments. At being unable to mobilize international funds, they turn to the domestic environment, they turn to local institutions, sometimes to the national insurance schemes, sometimes to the pension funds, sometimes to the commercial banks to raise money. And those institutions, as good corporate citizens with a patriotic stake in the country, sought to assist. And what they did, they, in some cases, went beyond the pale in terms of how much of their portfolio was in one country. And that has been the problem with Sagicor and Barbados, for instance. So if you are independently looking at